let's talk about the Dolby Atmos Music Curve. So this is a topic that I know there are a lot of different opinions on. I think I've heard them all from talking to a lot of different engineers. And for some reason, this particular aspect of Atmos, I feel like there is a lot more emotion attached to this than some of the other recommendations and specs and just things about Atmos. So I'm going to try and approach this. I want to try and keep this as objective as possible. You really need to form your own opinion on this. And I'm just going to kind of dive in. Before I dig in on this, though, I do want to say that I really love the folks over at Dolby. They've been a big help for me in getting up and running in Atmos. They've been very helpful in explaining things to me and their processes and how they go about calibrating things. So while there might be parts of this video where I may disagree with some things, it's just my opinion, purely my opinion. So you can form your own opinion, but all in all, I love the folks at Dolby and I really want them to succeed because I love this Atmos format that we are getting to work in today. So all that said, let's talk about the Dolby Atmos Music Curve. So what is the Dolby Atmos Music Curve? The Atmos Music Curve is basically a frequency response curve. It's Dolby's recommendation for how to tune your speakers. The big reason why we have a curve like this to begin with is because it's very important that all of our speakers, number one, we want them all to match each other tonally within our studio. That is Calibration 101, first thing, really important, because if we're flying stuff around the room and moving things around, we don't want our perception to change because of what speaker we put it in. Our perception, it is naturally going to change. When we move something from the front to the back, we hear a different frequency response because of the shape of our ears and how that sound is getting to our ears. It will shift, but part of that shift is a natural thing, and it is part of the cues that tell our brain where something is. So we want to keep the natural part of that. What we don't want is we don't want, say, our speaker in front to be sounding like one thing, and then when it goes to the back, well, the back speakers are brighter or they're darker or something like that. And now that's going to skew the decisions that we make when we're mixing. So very important. We want all our speakers to match tonally as closely as possible. The other side of the Dolby Atmos Music Curve is really an idea of translation. If everybody is using a similar curve, the theory goes that mixes will translate a whole lot better when we take them from one studio to another, when we play them back on one playback system and another playback system and another playback system. The idea is better translation. So where does this whole thing come from? The Dolby Atmos Music Curve is really kind of developed from the X curve. And the X curve is a frequency calibration curve that is used in movie theaters for tuning cinemas, basically. The X curve sort of came about in the 1970s. And for a long time, like really going back to the earliest days of sound in film, the Academy back then, they knew that we need some kind of standardization so that when you're making sound for a movie, it will sound relatively the same in different theaters. So what that ultimately culminated in was this thing we call the X curve, which showed up in the 1970s. The X curve, if you look at it, it looks very similar to the Dolby Atmos Music Curve, which is how we know that the music curve really kind of came from the X curve. Now, it's a little more complicated. They didn't just come up with this. There were engineers involved, but that's kind of how we have these two curves. Now, what you'll notice with the X curve is that the high frequency kind of rolls off. And the reason for this is what they discovered was when they were using an RTA, which stands for a real-time analyzer, when they were using an RTA to tune movie theaters, basically, when they tuned it flat in a very large space, when they played things back, it played back too bright. This is something that, to me, is an important thing to understand. When we put a measurement mic in a room and we plug it into an analyzer, that analyzer is dumb. It does not know the difference between what sound is coming out of the speakers and what sound is reflected and in the room. I need to interject something here. While the microphone doesn't know the difference between what's coming out of the speakers and what is reflecting in the room, our brain generally does a pretty good job of deciphering the difference between what is directly coming from the speakers and what is in the room. So the point is, the RTA measurement is not necessarily an accurate representation of our perception of the sound. When we are in a very large space, and really a lot of rooms in general, but definitely as the spaces get larger, low frequencies tend to hang around a lot longer. High frequency energy gets absorbed by the air more easily than low frequencies, and high frequencies are also easier to absorb with just other stuff in the room, from furniture, soft goods, bodies, or bags of water, as some of us like to refer to people. But the low frequency, that stuff, it reflects around the room and bounces around, and it tends to hang around a lot longer. If you've tried to treat acoustics in your studio, you probably already know that treating low frequencies is very, very difficult. And what ends up happening in these larger spaces a lot of the time is we have a reverb response in the room that is what some of us would say is tilted, where we have shorter reverb times at higher frequencies and longer reverb times at lower frequencies. When we play pink noise through a loudspeaker system in a large room and we look at our RTA, if that pink noise is balanced, it will tilt down in the high frequencies because the high frequencies get absorbed, and the lower frequencies will usually be longer and will hang around more, so we will see more amplitude on the low frequency side. So the X curve kind of came about because of this discovery of basically how the measurement platforms of the day worked, and it was a way for them to kind of go, hey, this is a good way to tune a speaker system so that the sound of one movie will sound good in more movie theaters. And this tuning was applied to what we call the B chain. Now, if you are putting in an Atmos system, the B chain is basically your processing and your speakers. In my room, for example, my B chain is my Matrix Studio and my Focal monitors. So the B chain of movie theaters for a long time tuned to the X curve. These days, there are actually multiple versions of the X curve. I need to jump in here. There aren't really multiple versions of the X curve, but there are some adjustments that are suggested based on the size of the room, but I'm jumping ahead. The way that high frequency energy is absorbed and measured at the mic, well, it changes depending on the volume, meaning like the cubic volume, the amount of air in the space, how how big and wide and tall your room is, that affects that measurement. As we go into smaller rooms, we're going to flatten that curve. And, when I was a kid, movie theaters, in the late 70s, early 80s, we didn't have the multiplexes that we have today. So most of the movie theaters, at least the ones that I grew up in, they were really big. And maybe part of that was because I was, 3-4 feet tall. But in comparison, they were really big compared to a lot of the movie theaters we have today, where we have multiple movie theaters in one cinema. Those theaters, if you're going to put that many screens in, they get smaller. It's not that same big theater that a lot of the theaters were at the time when the X-curve was developed. So the X-curve changed. Let's fast forward to the Dolby Atmos Music Curve. We have one curve right now, but not all studios are the same. My studio, for example, is just about as small as you can get to still put in a system where your layout actually meets the recommendations for Dolby Atmos. They have a recommendation for the layout of your speakers. It's not for the room size, which I think can be confusing. I know it was something that confused me early on, but the recommendation is actually for your speaker layout, how wide and big that has to be. And that is something I can talk about in another video because I've experienced it in a lot of different studios. And it does make a difference, but I digress. So the way you feel about the Atmos Music Curve, a lot of that might actually depend on what studio you actually heard it in. I think there are some studios where it is going to work really well, and there are other ones where maybe it is not to the taste of the engineer who is having it put on their speakers. So a few months back, I was curious about the calibration that was going on in my room. After having some conversations with different engineers and hearing different opinions on it, to my knowledge, I was tuned to the Atmos curve, but I just wanted to be sure. So I broke out my measurement rig and remeasured. So as I've mentioned in some other videos, I do a lot of calibration tuning of studios, concert PAs, churches, performance venues, things like that. That's something I've been doing for a long time. I use a measurement platform called Smaart, which is kind of the standard measurement platform for doing loudspeaker tuning, calibrating, optimization, whatever you want to call it. And it's also the same platform that Dolby uses. Now, when I tuned my speakers in here, I used Smaart to do my time alignment because I like to phase align things. I did another video on some of this calibration stuff and talked about this. But I did all the frequency calibration using SonarWorks. I could do it myself, but SonarWorks takes an hour about to measure everything. Doing it myself, I would probably spend all day on it. And in the past, I like the results that SonarWorks gets. I've A/B'd it against doing it myself, and sometimes I like SonarWorks better. So I just went with the SonarWorks tuning. Now, SonarWorks has different curves that you can pick from, and one of the curves that they offer is the Dolby Atmos curve. So I said, give me that one. And SonarWorks kicked out EQ values for me to input into the Matrix Studio. So I did that, and I listened, and I thought, hey, this sounds pretty good. It was not far off from the original tuning that I had done in here, because I know in the past I've poo-pooed the Atmos Music Curve. I put that on there, I started mixing, and I thought that my mixes, I was getting them where I wanted them to be a lot more easily. And I've taken mixes done in my room. I've played them in studios that use the Atmos Music Curve. I've played them in studios that Dolby tuned. I've played them in other studios that Dolby didn't tune, that have been properly calibrated. Translation has always been great. So I wanted to see, though, like, is this really the Atmos Music Curve? Because talking to some engineers, I was kind of wondering. So one thing I should mention, when I was measuring this in my room, I was trying to stick as close to Dolby's method for measuring as I can. Dolby, they have explained to me their process, and they use typically 6 microphones around the mix position that they average. I don't have 6 measurement microphones. I've done tunings in the past where we had, I think, up to 8 even, and just, I kind of found for myself 2 is plenty. And really, I could get by with just 1 if I had to. But for doing this, I set up 2 microphones near my mix position, and I'm averaging them together. I'm also going to be looking at primarily a 3rd octave in Smaart, which is what Dolby uses for the most part. They also do look at higher resolutions, which I did when I was doing this. For the most part, they're going to use the 3rd octave for most of the tuning and calibration they do. So that said, let's look at some of these measurements. So the first measurement, this is just what my speakers were before there's any tuning at a 3rd octave. Now, this is what SonarWorks did, and you can see it against the Atmos curve. Now, one thing I should mention in this video of what SonarWorks, that big bump in the low frequencies, SonarWorks did not do that. I did that because I like it, and it is good. I spent too many years working in front of large PAs with large substacks. I want low frequency. If I don't have enough low frequency, I will overmix it. So I put a big bump of low frequency in my system, and it is good. And when people come over and listen to mixes, I have never had anybody say, oh, that feels like too much. It feels right to me. Now, one of the other things, though, that you can see in the SonarWorks measurement is that top end, it's a little flatter, and there's a little bit of a rise in the high frequency, and it doesn't quite match the Atmos curve in my room, which was surprising to me, but it kind of helps explain to me why I kind of liked it. Now, here is footage I went through, and I manually re-equalized my system. I retuned it to meet the Dolby Atmos curve. So after listening to what really is the Atmos Music Curve in this room, I didn't care for it as much. I thought it was too dark. If I worked on that curve in this room, all of my mixes would be too bright. And when I was in Nashville and I was in Jeff Balding's room, I said the same thing to him, and he kind of laughed at me. Because some of this, and this is really important, some of this is personal taste. You know, we choose our speakers because we like the way they sound, and you will kind of learn how to mix on whatever you're working on. I think if I was on the Atmos Music Curve every day, I would probably be okay. I would learn to work to it, but it might frustrate me a little bit because it can be a little darker. Now, like I said, when I've taken mixes from this room and played them in studios that have the Atmos Music Curve, I can hear the curve. I can hear that my mixes are a little darker. They translate fine, though. It's just a taste thing for me. I'm not crazy about it being a little darker, but that's just for me. Other engineers, you might do better with that being darker. you've got to figure it out yourself. I think regardless of whatever you're working on, whether you have the Atmos curve, whether you have a different curve, whether you just have all of the same speakers in the room and you just let them be, not necessarily something I would recommend doing, but I know people do that. I mean, that's what we've been doing in studios for a long time. Whatever it is, it's really important that you learn the system and learn what are things supposed to sound like. I think on any monitor system, whether you're stereo Atmos, you have to learn your system. When I play things back through my speakers with that kind of SonarWorks curve along with my adjustments to it, slight tweaks, when I listen back to other people's mixes in here, I really like the way they sound. And that's why I think the stuff I've been doing in here, that's why it can translate to other systems outside of here. So you have to learn your system. Now, this is just my opinion, but I kind of think some of the controversy we see with the Atmos Music Curve, I think a lot of this stems from the sort of measurement process. Measuring speaker response with an RTA, it's kind of a dated approach, in my opinion. I think we have better tools today to do this, and let me explain. While in some ways an RTA in a well-treated room is going to be a fair way to measure things, these days we have something, and this is really one of Smaart's superpowers. We have this thing we call the dual FFT, or the transfer function is what Smaart refers to it. And what a transfer function is it's basically a comparison between two audio signals. So we can see the difference of what we're putting into our speakers versus what is coming out of the speakers. When it comes to system tuning, the way I was kind of taught was basically I want what is coming out of the speakers to sound like what is going into the speakers. So in other words, the speakers aren't going to color our mix as much. I don't want the speakers to mix for me. I want to have all the control, and I want the moves that I'm making to be represented on that system. That's where having this transfer function comes in handy, because now I can see how does my speaker actually affect the sound that is coming out. I think if more people who are calibrating systems moved over to using the transfer function for tuning studios for Atmos, I think more engineers would be happy with it. Now, they may still want to tweak some things to taste. RTA is not a perfect measurement, neither is a transfer function, but it tends to be a better representation of the high frequency content than what you see with an RTA. And in my experience, what you measure with something like Smaart's transfer function for, say, everything above 1K, that is a better representation of what the speaker's actually doing and what you probably want to hear than using an RTA to measure the same things. And it's just my opinion, but I would be really curious to see what a lot of the people who don't like the Atmos Music Curve, what would they think if we tune their system using Smaart's transfer function as opposed to an RTA trying to match the curve. I think translation from studio to studio would still work pretty good, and it would still kind of solve that issue. It would still solve the challenge of tonally matching all of our speakers, and I think it would make some engineers a little happier. Just my opinion, though, you can do good stuff with an RTA. And like I said, I know some engineers, they are very, very happy with the tuning that Dolby did. So you are free to form your own opinion on all of this. So should you use the Dolby Atmos Music Curve? Well, I think you should give it a try. I mean, it is the recommended way of doing things from Dolby. I always say start there and then branch off. I mean, there's a reason why they've got these recommendations out there. And whenever I sort of start, following them, usually works pretty good. So I think, you should try the Atmos Music Curve if you can. You can get Dolby will come in and they'll tune your system. There are independent people like me who tune systems too. So I'd say, try it. Whether you use that curve or not, I do think it is important to have your speakers tuned so that they do all match tonally to each other if you're going to work in this format. If you're going to do anything immersive, whether it's Atmos or something in the future, if you're putting in multiple speakers for a system that you're going to mix on, you need them all to work together cohesively and coherently and time aligned and frequency response calibrated, everything. It needs to all work the same. So I think it's a big recommendation for me. Get your system tuned. You can use something like SonarWorks or Sound ID reference. They have a multi-channel version. I've paired that with manual tuning. You could do the whole thing with it. I'd say use something like that. If you're not going to do anything though, which again, I don't recommend, I do think it's very, very important. You have got to have a way to play back commercially released Atmos mixes in your space. You've got to learn what are these things supposed to sound like. If you want your mixes to be able to sit in playlists and next to commercial releases, you've got to be able to release content and put out music that is going to sit with them. So you've got to learn what is it supposed to sound like in your room. You have to learn your speakers. And unfortunately, I don't think you can really learn your speakers using stuff that you worked on, because you're going to make it sound the way you think it should sound, but that's not necessarily the way things need to sound to translate outside of your room. I hope that helps explain some things on the Atmos Music Curve, what you feel about it, form your own opinion. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I know for me in my studio, it's not the best solution in my current room. Someday, if I go into a larger space, I'm going to try it for sure, because I think in a larger room, it's probably going to be better than in a smaller room. But, again, your mileage may vary. Form your own opinion. Give it a try. See if you like it. If not, it's okay. You don't have to use it. It's just a recommendation. My mixes in my room, they translate to every system I've played them on. It's really been really nice. So that's my 2 cents. Go make up your mind, but highly recommend get your system calibrated. If you need help with that, you can reach out to me through one of my websites. Links are below in the description. I'm happy to answer questions and to, chat and maybe help you tune your system. So thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.